All right, so the recording probably should be starting, and I will be starting to screen share here in a moment our presentation for today. Oops. Let me first do the screen share. You don't realize how dependent you are on two screens until you're forced to do one screen again. Okay, can folks see the screen? All right, so as we said, this is our first session of some technical support sessions for fiscal year 23-24 budget development. Some of the things that we do not have at this point in time, I want to make clear before we get through the end of the meeting. We do not have budget guidance from the mayor's office, so I will not be presenting on budget guidance or economic forecast or other indicators for preparing for 23-24.
Christy, if you're sharing, we can't see anything.
Yeah.
If you're sharing.
Oh, shoot. Okay, sorry, I thought I was sharing. Let's try this again. If only we had like a copy editor who's
Just
like,
click on your screen.
yes, that's what I thought I
There
did.
we go.
Am I sharing now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Ken, for raising that. So again, this is our first session for going through some of the technical supportive work that we have as part of our preparing for 23-24 budget development. We do not have mayoral budget guidance, and we also are still going to be working through some of the other policy decisions that council or the mayor may make in preparation for 23-24. What we are focusing on right now is to set up the framework and technical support for bureaus as they are working on other components of their budget, since there are many bureaus that we know are working right now, and that there are tools that would be helpful to them. So welcome to 23-24. I'm going to do a brief walkthrough of our online budget manual. And this framework. Then we're going to talk specifically today about building a base budget from a position management perspective. And then what are some of the more common actions performed in PCF? PCF is the position cost forecasting module of BFM. The anticipated PCF dates, and then we would like to reserve the remaining time as open for discussion or for Q&A that may be specific to your bureau, or some things that might help others with working through the budget modules and reporting. So just briefly, you may have seen in some of our communications, and I also apologize if there may have been some functionality that wasn't visible. It's hard as the I've never done website content development, so I apologize in advance for not recognizing if something has published or not published. And what we are really looking to do with the budget manual this year is to push out information, particularly content that is not a requirement of budget guidance, which a lot of what is in the current budget manual, the one for fiscal year 23-24, is relatively static year to year. Generally, what we are waiting on is mayor's budget guidance before we publish the entire manual. In the absence of having that budget guidance, we were looking to have a more dynamic format, which would allow us to have information out there for use that would allow for not having a concern with version control, and would provide a more frequent update for when that content is ready. So for these reasons, we started to look at some of the other options that we have, and I was particularly impressed with how council clerk has used the internal formats on their website for sharing information at council clerk's office, and said, like, you know what, maybe we should put out some of our information this way. Thus, the online budget manual has come to be. So we will plan to pause there for effect, I guess. These are the reasons why this is what we are looking to share, and how we'd be able to have this information ready for folks to send in our weekly communications. The initial prioritization for updates to the online budget manual. We're here today talking a little bit about position management and PCF information. We will be planning to publish our PCF and position management information in the budget manual by the end of this week. Submission requirements will be coming next. Once we have a little bit more firm dates confirmed with council and council offices, we'll be publishing those dates. Those are largely your spring dates. Budget guidance when we receive it, and then we will prioritize having checklists and report description cheat sheets to assist with bureaus as they are putting together their requested budgets. I also would be very supportive of any opportunity to if you see something else that is missing from this that would be helpful to be prioritized, to fold it into our online. So as we said before, the communication plan at present will be to use the CBO weekly emails to notify each week, starting in October, what new content is published and when it is available. We'll also try to highlight or call attention to specific components where we do have new information. We are also publishing, where relevant, or posting universal data sets or things that would be shared. So as you may have seen, the economic indicators provided by the city economist are now housed here. So hopefully you don't have to go and dig back for emails to say which email was it that had the attachment with the economic indicators, or which email had the attachment for the POBs transfer or the general fund transfer. We will be planning to post those type of workbooks and PDFs on this website as well. So that's kind of like the first bulk of information. Just like to see if there are any questions or comments on that before we transition into more of the technical components of PCF and physician management. It's a new way of sending out materials and communication. So I want to make sure that we're doing our best to get information to our bureau colleagues. And if there are things that would be helpful at this point in time, I will do my best to fold them in. Okay. So on to the technical fun, physician management in BFM. So I'm first going to walk through some of the city policies and components for budgeting. We'll give a brief overview of the relevant human resource admin rules, HRARs, as related to physician management and its interaction with the annual budget process. When review and reconciliation happens, and then ways to conduct review and reconciliation, and some tools to assist with physician management and how CBO can support you and your bureaus during this process. So Human Resources Administrative Rule 7.10. I'm not going to necessarily read the rule verbatim. I sort of highlighted the key components for the slides, but you can, and I will also send the slide deck afterwards as a PDF to the group. Human Resource HRAR 7.10 sets the organization and position management policies within the Bureau of Human Resources. The first is their key definition of an authorized position. Council approves all specific FTE and the level of funding for classified positions. This happens during the annual development of the budget. For limited terms that have not reached the end of its term, you will also see those in the position authority listed in your adopted budget. A budgeted FTE is a full-time equivalent position that is approved by council via this ordinance, and a budgeted FTE provides budgeted authority for the position. The classification is determined through the classification request. So this is kind of where budget, the realm of budget starts to meld with the realm of position creation and classification in SAP, the city system. So position authority in the adopted budget, where would you find this? There are two primary places. There's really three if we count BFM, but there's a couple primary places. So you can look in the adopted budget PDF format. If table 8 has which is on page 128, has the city's entire adopted FTE numbers. If you want to see the more detailed positions at the by bureau or by budget level, authority level, is you would be looking in volume 1 on your bureau specific pages. So for this example, I used FPDR just because it makes a nice, easy snapshot of a half page for this graphic. But this is where you could see like what was in your adopted budget as of June 30, 2022. The data will ultimately lie in our city's system of record And for BFM, the city's budget software, we do have saved off and archived adopted position data for reports that you can run as well. The thing that is the challenge, and this is has been the case for quite some time, is that there is no automatic process for adopted positions to move from BFM, the budget software, into SAP, the city's system of record. So in order to fill these newly established positions, they must move from BFM into SAP for bureau operations, and bureaus must submit a P4 to classify and establish a new position in SAP. So the last 2 years, we have started providing BHR class comp with an extract of all the new positions from BFM to assist in their planning processes for P4s, because this can be a significant volume of work that comes to BHR to set position classifications so bureaus can post, recruit, and fill the positions. This hyperlink goes to the online budget manual, which has a workbook that contains all of the only new positions by bureau that were added in the adopted budget. So if you want to see like a quick cheat sheet of what was in your adopted budget for new positions, that is one resource. BFM archive reports also will allow you to run this same data just for your specific bureau. So then there's another type of position movement. And so this position movement happens throughout the year based on bureau business needs. Reclassifications or creation of limited term where you are not seeking council funding or resources for that limited term position. A P4 is required by BHR to reclassify an existing position in SAP. If this is done before the P4 deadline or in SAP by the time of the last payroll update, then the reclassification should show up in BFM for your base budget development. If the deadline is missed, then bureaus may either reclassify in PCF in their base budget or at a later phase. That can be kind of tough, so that's why we sort of stress the timelines of getting the positions correct at the initial load. And if you are able to let your CBO analyst know if you're in this likely scenario, we can keep an eye out for it and then be ready to look at or to basically to advise on how to adjust for these kind of specific situations. One of the key things is that how important funding dates are for limited term employees. For both an regular FTE was when they start and how it would forecast, but then a limited term FTE would not only be a when it starts, but when does it end. So I'm going to hand this over to Robert Cheney, I think, at this point in time. Is this when we're going to do the handoff? Robert, I might be missing. I can't see you.
He turned his camera on. I think.
He's nodding.
He is nodding. Okay. You can tell me when you want the next slide, Robert, and we should be set.
Sure. So hello, everyone in person and online. Robert Cheney here. I administer BFM currently, and I've met a lot of you. I've had a lot of trainings last January, kind of walking through PCF, what PCF is, and we had some office hours in August for the fall bump that also walked through. They ended up being a lot about PCF, so I just wanted to reassure everyone that I'm going to talk about it at a high level again today, and then I'll probably have the same trainings that we had last January, this January, and I'm usually available to chat through things that you're seeing in BFM. I know Megan and Elizabeth can speak to that. I try to be as helpful as possible, but like we said, it's a pretty complex engine. So, and if you do have questions, you can always loop in your CBO analyst and me, and we can talk through them. So, all that said, let's walk through the slides, which again are a pretty high level explanation of what PCF is. So, PCF, personnel cost forecasting, it's a separate kind of module / engine within BFM, the budget software. It does create a separate universe of data. As we know, when budget data is created in BFM, we set up the system so it has full auditability, and you can allocate employees all certain ways, but at the end of the day, it is distilled into the 6-column upload into BFM, which is just our chart of accounts and budget amount data. So that's the background of it. You'll also hear us talk a lot about SBFS. SBFS is to BRASS, our legacy system, what PCF is to BFM. It's the separate salary benefit forecasting system, which is what the acronym stands for, or initialism. And then so because of that, SAP still the export files from SAP that we load into BFM are still called SPFS files. So that's why you'll still hear me refer to those files and that initialism. And moving down, it is the module specific to personnel costing. And as we know, it is its own stage in the early stages of budget development. We have our general fund load, we have our IA load, and then we have all of our personnel cost loading. And that's why fidelity from the budget system to the system of record is so important, because that stage is locked in and then budgets are edited afterwards. So like I said, the audit trail and the stage trail of all this is kind of really important as we try to make sure that everything is accurate as it moves through the system. Models. When we think about PCF, I often talk about projection zero. Projection zero is the baseline of all projection data. Because we budget in the current year through supplemental budgeting and we budget for the next year through budget development at the same time, PCF kind of lives and breathes over a 2-year period. So right now PCF is operating from 7/1/22 through 6/30/23. No, 24, sorry. And then so that's why when we make supplemental budget changes with PCF, those costs will point to the budget form if the funding date is set up correctly, or when we're budgeting for next year for budget development, it'll automatically populate to the tech adjustment form. What I also do is set up scenario projections that don't post to those forms at all. They only exist in reports, and that allows you to see kind of what the variables are tied to certain expectations. So like right now, I sent out an email to all brass users a couple weeks ago talking about, for example, projection 2024-01. It's a scenario projection that has certain presumptions. It has a 5% increase across all salary tables starting July 1st, 2023. And then additionally, sequentially, it has a 2% increase across all non-rep salary tables and existing salaries. The idea behind that is preliminary COLA estimates right now are about 5%, and we don't know what's going to happen with non-rep merit, but we had 2% last year, so I just kind of built a projection based off of that currently. As I learn more, I will probably develop more projections. If you have really specific needs around certain bargaining units or whatever, we can talk about other scenario projections you might need. But I think the big thing to kind of concretize in your mind is that projection zero is like the go-to base one, and that's what posts to forms. And that's the one that I update with the HCM data that comes out of SAP. So for example, currently projection zero has all of the data that was in SAP as of September 29th. And it does have all the new healthcare benefit rates and PERS rates they all start projecting on 7/1/23. The only thing it doesn't have right now are the updated TriMet rates, because those start on January 1st and they would have affected a lot of fall bump DPs. So I'll update those after we gavel in the fall bump. I will note, because of the slight variability between projection zero and like what it would look like with updated TriMet rates, I did create a different projection called 2023-24, and that one has the updated TriMet rates. So if you ran the C1 comparison report comparing projection zero to projection 2023-24, you'd see differences of about $40 per employee, and that's driven almost entirely by the updated TriMet rates, which are pretty small. And then as far as benefits goes, it's my understanding that there may be some changes to how the city costs out salary benefits, but I currently upload everyone's benefit elections into the system and cost them out based off of updated rates that I get from HR. What PCF doesn't do is forecast overtime or like most premiums are not costed out. So there are reports you can run in SAP Bob J that'll show you like prior year premium costs. Overtime is something that I'm sure the public safety folks can talk a lot about how they build that into their budgets. PCF does not do that. And then it's also where position authority comes from. So we have, as we know, for all permanent FTE, you require position authority, and I'm sure you've all had interactions with your CBO analysts where you've submitted a P4, and they ask you, when did council approve this position authority? We always check our budget forms and reports to make sure that it's in there. CBO has worked with class comp pretty closely the past couple budget cycles to where we have an updated report that shows all new positions created as part of a budget cycle. And we give that to class comp. And we say preemptively, this is a CBO wet signature. If a P4 comes in and it points directly to like, hey, this position was adopted by council on July 1 as a part of this DP. Class comp can preemptively just approve that position. So what that means is if you're using PCF and you're getting even limited term, which doesn't really require council authority, if you're using PCF to get that position into reports, it does allow us to deploy that process improvement of getting class comp to approve positions more quickly and not having to wait, not having the P4 sit in a CBO inbox for any amount of time. And then it is what we use, like we have exports for the adopted, like the same 302 report that y'all probably use to look at your position costing and authority. We have one for the adopted budget, the 22-23 adopted budget. And that's what we reconcile with SAP, because at the end of the day, SAP is the system of record. And we can go on to the next slide. This is kind of just getting in the weeds here. There are different types of FTE applicable in BFM. Typically, when you're using the position wizard and you create a new FTE, you'll see, regular permanent. I think permanent's the main word that we use, like a permanent FTE. And then you select actually an account. You would say probably 511-100, so that those costs point to your kind of permanent salary costs. And then you can also create a limited term FTE that and you would select 511-200, I believe, to have the cost post there. What you can't really do in PCF and is more I believe HCM type things are casual or temporary employees or double fills. Those are things that happen. So like a double fill utilizes position authority, right? That's not going to come across in the budget system when we do personnel loads. So we typically rely on Bureau Finance managers to kind of keep track of those costs as they're building out their budgets. And then another point I wanted to kind of hammer again is that you always want to make sure that when you are costing out employees, that you're putting the funding dates in correctly. For a new permanent FTE in budget development, you'd probably put 7/1/23 and then an end date of like 2050. But typically for supplemental budgets, like in the fall, you'd want to use a current year funding date so that you'd actually cost out things as accurately as possible. I did see there's an instance where someone added an employee in the fall bump where the funding date was 7/1/23. So no costs hit into the budget part of the DP form, because the budget part of the DP form was focused on the fiscal year 22. So that's just something to keep in mind is not only does funding date matter, but the allocation matters. If you only allocate an employee 50%, they're only going to cost out 50%. And that goes for, I think the best way to kind of conceptualize that is when you're putting in count in the position wizard, count times allocation equals what the projected cost will be. The FTE part, so I think y'all are probably mostly familiar, and we'll dive deep into this in January during the trainings. There's like an FTE component, and then there's a count. they're completely independent from each other. FTE is just an FTE. That's how it will show up in reports. And count is typically you want those two to be the same thing, but you need to update both. So for negative FTE, you put like -1 and then a -1 on the count so that the costs project as a negative amount. But they are separate. And like I said, it's probably a little confusing for me to talk about, especially without visual aids, but we'll dive more into it as we move along the process. Chrissy, if you want to go to the next slide. So the adopted budget plus any current year changes becomes the future or base budget for budget development year. So like I said earlier, we have like 3 different parts of V51, V51 being the base budget load. There's the Cal targets as part of the general fund development forecast and whatnot. There's the IA developments that we work with Aaron Beck and his team on. And then we have the PCF load. And that all points to your tech adjustment form. And those populate automatically. The reason, again, that we want to make sure we're doing our personnel authorization to what's budgeted at maximum fidelity is that it allows that V51 stage that's locked in to be 100% accurate with what the reality of your personnel authorization is. Otherwise, it looks like you've added positions that have already been added. And then, of course, V52 is the requested budget stage. You'll see it V52 with DP, without DP. That's where you want to be making the changes to your base, and that's what's going to show up in the audit trail. Where the basically augmentations or subtractions from your budget will kind of show up. So that's why it's so important that V51 is 100% accurate. And we'll go to the next slide. So yeah, to just mention this point again, we currently have in budget development, in the budget development folder, personnel folder of BFM, there's your 302 that has projection 0 that I've already talked about, plus the scenario projections. There's also a folder in there that says adopted FY 22-23 reports. And there's a 302 in there that has a snapshot of position authority that was adopted by council as of July 1. That's pretty much what we're going to use to check against SAP. To the extent that there are permanent FTE in the adopted report that aren't in the adopted report in BFM that aren't in SAP, typically indicates to us that a P4 has not been processed yet. If that P4 does not get processed before the last personnel load, we just have to make sure that we add that personnel in BFM so that when it does eventually get added, everything ties out. And the best way that we do that is we'll take that 302 report that focuses on the FY 22-23 adopted, and we'll compare it to the ZHERD positions by PA report in SAP.
So this, Robert, this was the one that's like a whole bunch of words on how you would do this. I can show an Excel version of what it means in Excel as well. So we can go through this step and then I have an example.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, this is just like a slide talking about how we would do this analysis, right? Comparing a BFM report to an SAP report. And Chris, you can kind of demonstrate what that looks like. Everyone does analysis differently, obviously, but this is the spirit of it.
Yeah, so what this file shows is this is an extract from SAP, the raw data of your ZHERT report made into a pivot table, and then a VLOOKUP compared to your BFM adopted positions. So I copied this, I used BOEF just as an example. This is from the report that we have posted on our website, and also could be run with the snapshot of adopted new positions for a specific bureau. And I basically just compare them, and I can see that there are 4 positions that were identified likely as a new limited term position tied to a decision package that may be in the P4 process. So I would just, check in with the bureau and see if the HR has them, then they'll probably get there. But these would be ones that I would look at to make sure that we would be in contact with that, like defined window when we can make those position changes that in BFM before we stage to the requested. So part of why this is particularly important is also to have that defined cutoff date so we can move the entire city forward to have full access to all forms. But this is just an example of one way to go about doing this analysis and some of the tools that I would use to start the process.
From the top.
From the top, here we are. So basically this is just a written out steps of the reports. And then the example was the Excel file. So one of the things with the data set right now is that it's pre-bump because why looking at what was in the adopted budget as compared to SAP, you have a relatively contained data set because it is pre-bump. There's about 50 positions, I think, in the bump as filed, something along those lines. That's wholly separate. But that's kind of like gives you like a relative subset to compare against. Send it back to Robert.
Sure. So, as we do that process, and I've already said this earlier, we'll make sure that ideally you've submitted all your P4s back in July. They were all in the report that we sent to class comp, so CBO didn't even need to sign them, and all of that position authority is now in SAP. Reality, that's probably not the case, especially folks who maybe have a lot of positions to add. So then what we do is we do the analysis that Chrissy kind of just showed that how she would do it. To the extent, like if we do it preliminary and there's still time to get it in SAP, then ideally we would do that. We would get it in SAP and it would get pulled from SAP and be loaded into BFM and match for the V51 load. If not, we just kind of live and breathe in V51 and we go into PCF employee maintenance and we add new positions that reflect the positions that were added with council authority, but not input into SAP at that time. And then it looks like Elizabeth Gallagher, Jess raised an interesting point. From a process perspective,
yes,
does it make sense to have a class comp determination made before a position is brought forward?
Yes, it does. That would mean you would need class comp reviewing your potential position asks right now in order to have them for your January request. It'd be a major process change. So we're not necessarily there, yes, but from a perspective of what would it take to have positions ready to recruit and fill on July 1, that would be a significant step to know that whatever is in the adopted budget has been through a classification process and is ready to go.
Yeah, and to that point, we work closely with Liam and the folks at Class Comp, and there are certain things that kind of trigger P4. So like if you requested an FA2 and then you scope out the work and Class Comp's like, actually that's a manager 1, then that would trigger a CBO review during the P4 because we would want to make the point that you only got funding for an FA2. So you would need to find whatever the delta is between a fully funded FA2 and a fully funded manager 1 would need to be absorbed by the Bureau. So to mitigate that, I think it's an excellent point that you'd probably want to like get someone in Class Comp's eyes on any position requests that you have or someone in your office. I do know that BHR just doesn't have a lot of capacity right now. But you're right, it is hairy to untangle. So to the extent that you can crush it on the ability to forecast what the position is, that way you can make sure that you request a sufficient funding. Because as we know, the way that PCF generates costs is it generates costs at the entry level for represented position and middle of step for non-rep. And then it has a pretty basic benefits calculation. So, and I think, like I said, that benefits calculations might be moving towards a different direction soon. I don't even know how concrete that is or how much to say about it, but There are certain there's a certain variability in what an employee ends up costing and what kind of funding is given. Typically, a bureau can absorb that kind of variability within vacancy savings. And then I know BHR or not BHR, OMF's inflation factor spreadsheet typically presumes about 10 grand in materials and services need per employee. I think that's, I don't know all the assumptions of that, but I think that's a perfectly reasonable thing to build in. PCF will not. If you make a new position in PCF using the position wizard, it will not assume 10 grand in materials and services needs. So that's, again, something you're going to want to consider as you're costing out new employees. But it's an excellent point by Elizabeth.
I think one of the challenges, like just the dynamic nature of some of the work in a large organization that has nearly 7,000 employees. So when you have a vacancy, it's an opportunity sometimes to restructure, to reclass, and that vacancy may come up during the year that was not known at the time of your requested budget. And leadership may, and your bureau may decide to do something different when they have those opportunities. So that's where we get into a lot of like challenges with flexibility and what we can do. So it's not to say that the idea of doing something more structured around classification at the beginning of the process isn't the way that we should be going. I think it's also recognizing that, for maybe 80% of the positions, we should be absolutely doing that. But like there could be a 20 to, hopefully no more than 20%, but like there will be a dynamic nature amongst different bureaus, lines of business, organization structures, et cetera, that they would want to or still pursue flexible reclassifications during the year. And quite honestly, during the budget process, we've all seen where, let's say a position gets created in the mayor's proposed. That's not going to class comp before it gets into the mayor's proposed. A position is going in the mayor's proposed. So like those are some of the things that that also tend to pop up that can cause some of the challenges with reconciling position authority. So basically the words on this slide are looking to how would you compare for those, let's say those P4s that said I had a coordinator 1, but either through attrition or through a different direction, it's now going to be a coordinator 2. Well, those P4s are kind of like the untrackables. They're not in the adopted budget and they happened before the fall bump, but they're sort of roaming around out there. And so I think those are the ones that are that are particularly challenging to make sure that they are correct and what you intend to see. Particularly sometimes those P4s may not come by the finance manager's shop for tracking or for logging to see that there's been a change. These are probably some of the more challenging ones to find, and that's where like I think some of the 302 reports, once we are able to have a little bit more of the frequent uploads. Frequent means every 2 weeks for pay periods. But those are kind of the ones that are tough to hunt down and to make sure we catch them before we roll the system over to V52. So back to you, Robert.
So to the extent that once we do the final load from SAP into BFM and we kind of lock it, to the extent that there are council authorized positions that aren't in BFM, we will have to add those manually, us and CBO. Last year we did something where, because there were so many positions in the fall bump, we had our vendors basically take all of the positions that existed in the fall bump form 1840 and can basically move them over to projection 0. There's a chance we could do that again this year, but ideally we will want to make sure it's as close as possible beforehand. So more to come on that. But as it says here, to the extent that there is a delta between what is authorized and what's in BFM, we manually add that in through employee maintenance, add new. So that's kind of what happens then. And then the next slide. Yeah, so this is something that I'm sure there's a few folks out here who know this because um, certain salary tables and benefit rates couldn't be updated in projection zero without knocking a lot of existing DPs out of balance, DPs that had positions in them. So the workaround for that was I created the projection I mentioned earlier. It's called, instead of projection zero, it's called projection 2023-24. And that has all of the updated PERS rates, TriMet rates, and healthcare rates in there. And it doesn't have any inflation, like salary inflation's done. That's what the scenario projections 2024-00 and 2024-01 have, which is currently 5% COLAs, and one of them has 5% COLA and then a 2% non-rep merit, which I had sent out an email on. I'll send out another email tomorrow on this new projection that we're using, 2023-24, which should be defunct as soon as council adopts this bump that's upcoming on the 27th, at which point I will update projection zero to match it. But that's the reason that there's a little bit of a delay in the process. We can go to the next slide. This slide just highlights some common actions that occur in PCF. So you can reallocate a position in employee maintenance. We'll talk through that in January trainings. You would look up someone in PCF employee maintenance and then just change which projects or funded programs or functional areas or fund centers you want to point them to. You can add or reduce positions. You can do that in Form 1720 DP, or you can do it in employee maintenance. And again, employee maintenance affects projection zero, which is what points to your tech adjustment 1710 form. So that's all kind of living, breathing personnel movements that actually will end up in an appropriation by council. Then of course there's, you can use DP's Form 1720 to reduce a position using -1 on the count. And then ideally you would also put -1 on the FTE so that certain reports populate correctly. And the inverse of that is, as we all know, it's a very popular thing to do. You can use a DP to add a position, or at least request an add. Obviously, the reason base budget position reports and data is not highlighted is because it's not really something that bureaus are actively like affecting right now. So currently, no end users have access to BFM, or sorry, to PCF, to employee or position maintenance, but you do have access to personnel reports that show what's currently in the system, and that's what your 302s and above, your C1 comparison report, those should reflect data that's in SAP as of 9/29. And is that the last slide?
Nope. So yeah, I'm watching my time check and now starting to think about how the rest of these are going to go. I think this one we just wanted to kind of talk again. Robert has mentioned some of the names, but these are some of the common reports or snapshots that he's configured. So we can go through the slide deck and then show some examples to the extent BFM is cooperating. But that's just like a highlight of some of the features or functionalities that exist.
Yeah, so the C1 report, I'm using a lot of the BFM speak, mostly because I think this audience is pretty familiar with it. But if you have any questions, I know that it can be really confusing to use that speak if you're not familiar with it. So yeah, we have the C1 comparison reports. We have full personnel, like really fully loaded reports. The PFMLA report shows it has the cap of what the policy states the salary is capped at what point you can cost it out. So and then non-rep merit, we currently have a projection for that. So you can use the comparison and personnel count reports to look at both projection zero and then all the scenario projections. So if we want to look at that too, we can kind of demo that out.
So then the last two slides, just briefly, and then we can have open for either demonstration or questions. I think these are our relevant dates. I know that didn't sound very confident, but what we're looking at is trying to time around pay period end dates, and when the data's information is available in SAP means we have the ability to upload into BFM. And then, like we had said before, we're really trying to target that 11/9 pay period end date for the SAP snapshot date. This is based on a couple of factors. One is it is one of the, as Robert has said, it's one of the 3 sort of critical path items to allow for full system opening. We've both through survey and through additional end user meetings have definitely recognized and heard the importance of bureaus for having access into the systems in order to prepare their budgets. And so this is a critical path item, that is primarily why we are highlighting it as an item to work through. It's not dependent on budget guidance. It's something we can do now. Also, for a point of reference, the systems were largely unavailable until January. Last year was the first year that we were able to have BFM openings happen in the middle of December, and we are hoping to be as consistent as that, if not earlier, and that is a lot of what is driving the selection of these dates. And to the extent we can all collectively work on position management, position maintenance in November, then I think we'd be able to have our best opportunity for having the system open for everyone's benefit and access in December. I will be also publishing this date in the next CBO comms and onto the budget manual. We are planning to have the requested budgets due on January 26th. That's the same date it was last year. It's just as a Thursday instead of a Wednesday. So that's just to help with planning efforts, and also why we were looking to have system open earlier in December is because we know that there is a high potential for vacations are either already currently planned or in the planning process throughout the city around the year-end timeframe and holiday periods. So we want to be respectful of that and do what we can to have as much access availability as early as possible. So this is what we were looking at for our next couple of these sessions. As you said, we're still waiting on budget guidance. So when we have budget guidance, we will have a session for that. But some of the other items that we really wanted to highlight and to make sure we had some time set aside for Bureau Finance contacts is to look at these particular areas. So our next one will be those submission document requirements, which will include the other components of your budget submission, whether it's your 5-year plan, your narrative, your budget equity tool. We anticipate working through those processes, documents, and information on November 2nd. We're going to look at some of the functionality in forms, just a nice refresher of what the different forms are, how to use them. They might not be open for you maybe, but like that one's maybe an open to interpretation. Peter will be able to talk about Cal targets and general fund overhead on December 1st. And as I have on December 15th, I'm definitely open to other suggestions if there are things that this group would like to have some additional information on, in particular, if you think it's something that would be more relative than or helpful than some of the other items above. That's what we have for our prepared slides. I'm happy to turn it over to the group for questions, or if you would like to use this time to see any of the reports that Robert has talked through. If we have that functionality available, happy to do that as well. Just want to see what is best useful for this group right now.
Yeah, or if folks want to play around with reports and take a first pass at, making sure that everything looks mostly accurate. There was a lot of issues with employee validation because a lot of the job classes that were formerly non-rep that became DCTU and COPIA were basically not projecting. I think that's all fixed now, but to the extent you see any issues, and then I can also, at a future point in time, if you guys want like a more interactive, hands-on demonstration, we can talk through how to compare certain reports. Obviously, the C1 report is good for looking at a really summary type basis of how like a projection 0 compares to a 5% COLA with 2% non-rep merit. But I've also added some functionality to the 302 export that would allow you to do that as well. So yeah, I would encourage folks to dive in and then ping me and your CBO analyst to the extent you see anything. It looks like Anthony Martin said he wanted to note the timing for Bureau verification of BFM positions is right around the third Thursday in November.
Yeah, it is. That's why we have at least a 2-week time period, the 17th through December 1st. That's longer than we've held in the past, and it's an attempt to account for Thanksgiving holidays. So I think it's a challenge that we have is it's either going to push up against end of year December compression or November. And you're kind of sandwiched in between the bump that will not end. So with having the current bump filed for October 27th, and then any potential changes that may happen on the general fund ordinance, which is scheduled on November 17th. So these are a lot of the the challenges with dovetailing this process in between the different business items that are impacting all of us for this. And I think that's one of the other reasons why looking at positions right now that we're in the adopted budget and any P4s that you've been tracking in advance of when we have that final snapshot would also help. Would also help with having hopefully fewer positions to look at or reconcile against in November. I think also for Elizabeth's question, if you have open bargaining agreements, then depending on those agreements, if there's no data from SAP to pull into BFM, then I don't know how BFM would project it. So that is one of the challenge points for open bargaining agreements. I'm going to let Robert take Anthony's question.
Yeah, Anthony, I thought we did something about that last year, but it's been a while. So let's talk through that offline. Because I thought basically what happened was there was no home functional area in BFM, and then I had reached out to the vendor about potentially creating that data point. But I'd have to double check the SBFF's 1 report to see if there's. Yeah, we'll chat about it some more.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, I do know we did talk about it last year. I just can't remember if it was we'll work on it or it's just not possible. So thank you.
Yeah. Let's follow. I'll follow up.
It's been a year. There's a lot that I can't remember what was. Yes, I will PDF and share this presentation. We will also take the recording and maybe post it to our YouTube channel. Remember to like and subscribe. So those are some of the things that we're looking to do with how we can share content. Definitely appreciate everyone's time here. And like I said, if there are other items you think that this type format for sharing information, whether it's in the budget manual or walking through processes or steps, would be helpful. This is the opportunity to let us know, and I will gladly do what I can to incorporate into a presentation or to some form of tools to share with this group. All right, with that, I think I will end recording and we can end the meeting. Thank you very much.